Hello, and welcome back to my Midnight Historian. Tonight, we're travelling more than 3,000 years into the past to uncover the extraordinary story of Tutankhamun, the boy king of ancient Egypt whose short life, mysterious death, forgotten tomb, and breathtaking treasures would eventually make him the most famous pharaoh in the modern world. So, settle in, get comfortable, and if you enjoy peaceful journeys through the mysteries of the past, subscribe to Midnight Historian and join us as we step quietly into the golden age of ancient Egypt. Our story begins around 1341 BC, during one of the most fascinating and turbulent periods in Egyptian history. Along the fertile banks of the Nile stood temples, palaces, workshops, farms, and cities belonging to a civilization that had already existed for thousands of years. Egypt was wealthy and powerful, its influence stretching far beyond the Nile Valley, and at the center of this world stood the Pharaoh, a ruler believed to occupy a sacred position between humanity and the gods. Into this royal world a child was born who would eventually become known as Tutankhamun. His early life remained surrounded by uncertainty. Modern research strongly suggests that his father was Pharaoh Akhenaten, the controversial ruler who transformed Egyptian religion by elevating the solar deity Aten above the traditional gods. Akhenaten established a new royal capital at Ankhesenamun, the city we now call Amarna, and filled it with temples open to the sunlight. The changes were dramatic. For generations, Egyptians had worshipped gods such as Amun, Osiris, Ptah, and many others. Their temples possessed enormous wealth, and their priests held considerable influence. Akhenaten disrupted this ancient order, and the royal family became closely associated with the worship of Aten. Somewhere within this unusual royal environment, the young Tutankhamun spent his earliest years. He was originally called Tutankhaten, a name connected to Aten. He could not have known that within only a few years the religious world created by his father would begin to disappear. Akhenaten died when the boy was still young, and Egypt entered a complicated period of succession that historians are still attempting to reconstruct. Eventually, at roughly 8 or 9 years old, Tutankhaten became pharaoh. Imagine the scale of what surrounded him. He was a child occupying the throne of one of the richest kingdoms on earth. Officials bowed before him. Priests performed ceremonies in his presence, servants prepared his clothing and meals, scribes recorded royal commands, soldiers protected the kingdom, while experienced advisors helped conduct affairs that a young ruler could scarcely have understood alone. His marriage was also tied to the royal family. Tutankhamun married Ankhesenamun, a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and therefore probably his half-sister. Such marriages within royal families were not unprecedented in ancient Egypt, where preserving the royal bloodline and political legitimacy could outweigh concerns familiar to modern society. Soon, the young king's reign became associated with a major reversal of his predecessor's policies. The old gods returned to prominence, the temples of Amun were restored, religious institutions regained their importance, and the royal court moved away from Akhenaten's abandoned capital. Even the king's name changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, meaning roughly, living image of Amun. The change represented far more than a new name. It announced that Egypt was returning to traditions that had shaped the kingdom for centuries. Yet behind the golden image of kingship stood a real young person. Objects later discovered in his tomb offer intimate glimpses into his life. There were bows and arrows, chariots, furniture, clothing, sandals, games, jewellery, containers for food and drink, ceremonial objects, and personal possessions. These objects remind us that Tutankhamun was not merely a golden mask from a museum. He lived, walked through palace rooms, watched the Nile rise and fall, participated in ceremonies, travelled in chariots, and grew from a child king toward adulthood beneath the enormous expectations of the Egyptian throne. But his life would be astonishingly brief. Before reaching his 20th birthday, Tutankhamun was dead, leaving behind a kingdom, a young widow, and questions that would survive for more than 3 millennia. His sudden death required preparations for a royal burial, and somewhere in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, workers prepared the small tomb that would one day become one of archaeology's greatest discoveries. At the time, however, no one could have imagined what would happen thousands of years later. To the people who carried the young pharaoh toward his final resting place, this was not an archaeological treasure waiting to be discovered. It was the beginning of his journey into eternity. The death of Tutankhamun must have sent an unexpected shock through the royal court. He was still only about 18 or 19 years old, an age when a pharaoh might normally have expected decades of rule ahead of him. Egypt suddenly faced the death of a king who appears to have left no surviving heir. 2 tiny mummified fetuses discovered in his tomb are generally believed to have been his daughters, suggesting that Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun attempted to produce an heir, but their children did not survive. For the young queen, the loss may have been devastating. For the officials surrounding the throne, it created an urgent political problem. Egypt needed a ruler, but before questions of succession could be settled, the dead king had to be prepared for eternity. Ancient Egyptians believed death was not simply the end of existence. The deceased could continue into another world, provided the body was preserved and the proper rituals were performed. For a pharaoh, those preparations were especially elaborate. Tutankhamun's body was taken into the care of embalmers, specialists whose work combined practical knowledge with sacred ceremony. The process traditionally lasted around 70 days. His internal organs were removed and preserved, while the body was treated with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that helped draw out moisture and prevent decay. Oils and resins were applied, and the body was carefully wrapped in layers of linen. Amulets and sacred objects were placed among the wrappings to protect the king during his journey beyond death. Eventually, Tutankhamun's face was covered with the magnificent golden mask that would become one of the most recognizable objects ever discovered from the ancient world. Yet the burial preparations seem to have happened under unusual pressure. Tutankhamun had died unexpectedly, and the tomb chosen for him was relatively small compared with the enormous royal tombs created for some other pharaohs. Archaeologists have long wondered whether the chamber had originally been intended for someone else and was adapted quickly after the young king's death. Whatever the reason, the space was filled with an extraordinary collection of objects intended to accompany him into eternity. There were beds, chairs, chests, statues, weapons, walking sticks, clothing, jewellery, food, wine, games, ceremonial equipment, and several chariots. Many objects were covered with gold. Others were decorated with scenes of the king and queen together. Some were practical possessions from life, while others were created specifically for burial. At the heart of the tomb was the burial chamber. Enormous gilded wooden shrines surrounded a stone sarcophagus. Inside were nested coffins, each protecting the king more closely than the last. The innermost coffin was made from solid gold and weighed more than 100 kilograms. Within it rested Tutankhamun himself, wrapped and adorned for eternity. Once the ceremonies were complete, the entrances were sealed. The living returned to the world above, and the young king disappeared into darkness. Then something remarkable happened. Egypt moved on without him. Other rulers came to power, and Tutankhamun's name gradually faded from public memory. His association with the religious upheaval of Akhenaten's family may have contributed to later attempts to remove this period from official history. Buildings were dismantled, names disappeared from monuments, and later generations knew little about the boy king. This forgetting would eventually help protect him. The Valley of the Kings contained the tombs of some of Egypt's most powerful rulers, and those tombs attracted thieves even in ancient times. Gold, jewellery, precious stones, oils, furniture, and other valuable objects could tempt anyone willing to risk entering the sacred chambers. Many royal tombs were robbed, sometimes not long after their occupants had been buried. Tutankhamun's tomb was not completely untouched. Evidence suggests that thieves entered it in antiquity, probably more than once. Yet for reasons that remain partly uncertain, they did not empty it. The entrances were resealed, and eventually the location became obscured. Debris from later construction accumulated nearby. Workers built huts above parts of the area, apparently unaware that a royal tomb lay beneath them. Century followed century. Egypt changed rulers, languages, religions, and empires. The temples of the pharaohs became ancient ruins. Sand and stone concealed entrances that had once been known to priests and workers. Tutankhamun remained below the Valley of the Kings, surrounded by objects that no living person had seen for thousands of years. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, however, Egypt had become the focus of intense archaeological exploration. Researchers from around the world came searching for temples, inscriptions, mummies, and royal tombs. The Valley of the Kings was investigated repeatedly, and many believed that its greatest discoveries had already been made. One archaeologist disagreed. His name was Howard Carter. Carter had spent years working in Egypt and had developed a remarkable understanding of the valley. He became convinced that the tomb of the little-known pharaoh Tutankhamun had never been properly located. With financial support from the wealthy British aristocrat Lord Carnarvon, Carter began a search that would test years of patience. Season after season, workers removed enormous quantities of rubble under the Egyptian sun. They found objects and traces of ancient activity, but not the royal tomb Carter believed was still hidden somewhere beneath their feet. Eventually, Carnarvon began losing confidence. The search was expensive, and after years without the great discovery they hoped for, he considered ending the project. Carter persuaded him to fund one final season. In the autumn of 1922, the team returned to the valley. They began digging near the tomb of Rameses VI, in an area partly covered by the remains of ancient workers' huts. Then, on November 4th, a worker uncovered something beneath the debris. It was not gold, a statue, or a mummy. It was a single step cut into the rock. As more earth was removed, another step appeared, and then another. A staircase was descending into the ground. Howard Carter had spent years searching for Tutankhamun. Now, beneath thousands of years of rubble, he was standing above a sealed doorway. The discovery of the staircase changed everything. Carter immediately understood that he might be standing above something extraordinary, but he resisted the temptation to rush forward. The excavation was carefully cleared until the upper portion of a sealed doorway emerged from the earth. On its surface were ancient impressions left by official seals, including symbols associated with the royal necropolis. Carter searched for the name he desperately hoped to find. At first the evidence was incomplete, but the doorway appeared ancient and largely undisturbed. Instead of opening it immediately, Carter ordered the entrance protected and sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England, telling him that a magnificent discovery had been made in the valley and asking him to come to Egypt. For nearly 3 weeks, the secret beneath the ground remained closed. Carter waited while Carnarvon travelled to Egypt with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. On November 24th, 1922, the team returned to the staircase and fully exposed the doorway. Now they could see impressions bearing the throne name of Tutankhamun. After years of searching, Carter finally had evidence that he had found the lost resting place of the boy king. Yet there were also signs that the entrance had been disturbed in antiquity and resealed. Perhaps ancient thieves had already entered. Perhaps nothing valuable remained inside. The only way to know was to continue. The first doorway was opened, revealing a descending corridor filled almost completely with limestone rubble. Workers carefully removed the debris until another sealed doorway appeared at the far end. On November 26th, Carter made a small opening in its upper corner. Warm air that had been trapped inside for centuries escaped through the hole. Carter inserted a candle and looked through. At first, the darkness revealed little. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the flickering light, shapes began to emerge. Strange animals, gilded furniture, statues, boxes, and the unmistakable shine of gold filled the chamber beyond. Carnarvon, waiting behind him, reportedly asked whether he could see anything. Carter's famous reply was, "Yes, wonderful things." The chamber was not empty, it was overflowing. When the doorway was eventually opened enough to enter, Carter and his companions stepped into what archaeologists now call the antechamber. The scene was astonishing. Objects had been packed into the room so densely that moving among them required extraordinary care. 3 large ceremonial beds decorated with fantastic animal forms stood along one side. Chariots had been dismantled and stacked together. Boxes and chests were scattered around the chamber. There were stools, baskets, weapons, walking sticks, containers, clothing, and furniture decorated with gold and precious materials. 2 life-size black statues of Tutankhamun stood facing one another, near another sealed doorway, appearing almost like guardians protecting whatever lay beyond. For Carter, the excitement was accompanied by an enormous responsibility. These objects had remained in darkness for more than 3,000 years. Many were fragile. Wood had dried and weakened. Textiles could crumble when touched. Decorative surfaces could separate from their foundations. Before the burial chamber could be opened, the antechamber had to be documented and cleared. Photographer Harry Burton was brought in to create a detailed visual record. His photographs would become some of the most famous archaeological images ever taken. Every object was numbered, photographed, drawn, described, stabilized, and carefully removed. What appeared at first to be a chaotic pile slowly became a record of royal life and death. Among the objects was a magnificent throne, showing Tutankhamun seated, while Ankhesenamun gently touches him. The intimate scene offered a rare glimpse of the royal couple, represented not as distant symbols, but in a moment of closeness. Other objects showed the king hunting, fighting enemies, or performing ceremonial duties. There were sandals decorated with images of foreign captives, bows and arrows, shields and chariots that reflected the military symbolism of kingship. There were also objects far more personal in character, including clothing and walking sticks. More than 100 walking sticks and staffs were eventually found in the tomb, an intriguing detail when considered alongside modern evidence that Tutankhamun may have suffered problems affecting his feet and mobility. Beyond the antechamber lay another small room later called the annex. It contained hundreds of objects crowded together, including vessels, baskets, food supplies, oils, games, and other equipment. The disorder suggested that ancient intruders may once have disturbed the room before officials resealed the tomb. Yet the most important doorway remained closed. Between the 2 guardian statues stood a sealed entrance leading toward the burial chamber. On February 16th, 1923, Carter opened it. What he saw was almost overwhelming. The room beyond was dominated by an enormous gilded wooden structure that filled nearly the entire chamber. It was the outermost of 4 nested shrines built around Tutankhamun's sarcophagus. Their surfaces were covered with religious texts and protective imagery intended to surround the dead king with divine power. Opening these shrines became another slow and delicate process. One enclosure stood inside another, creating layers of protection around the center of the burial. Eventually, the team reached a massive stone sarcophagus. When its lid was raised, another extraordinary sight appeared, a human-shaped coffin covered in gold. But this was only the first of several nested coffins. Inside the outer coffin was a second, richly decorated coffin, and inside that lay the innermost coffin, made from solid gold. It portrayed Tutankhamun as the eternal ruler of Egypt, holding the crook and flail across his chest. The young king who had disappeared from history was surrounded by more wealth than Carter could have imagined. Yet the greatest encounter still lay inside. In 1925, the innermost coffin was opened, revealing the mummy of Tutankhamun. Over the head and shoulders rested the famous golden funerary mask. The face was calm and idealized, with dark-lined eyes, a ceremonial false beard, and the striped royal headdress. The mask was crafted from gold and decorated with coloured glass and semi-precious materials. On the forehead were the cobra and vulture, symbols associated with royal authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. The young ruler had been transformed into an eternal image of kingship. The mummy itself presented difficulties. Large quantities of resin used during burial had hardened, effectively attaching the body to the coffin. Carter's team attempted to separate the mummy so it could be examined, and their methods were far more invasive than modern archaeological standards would permit. The body was eventually removed and studied, beginning a century of scientific attempts to understand the life and death of Tutankhamun. Yet the burial chamber was not the final room. A doorway led into the treasury, where one of the most striking objects in the entire tomb stood beneath the watch of a black statue of Anubis, the jackal-associated god connected with embalming and the dead. Inside the treasury was a magnificent gilded shrine containing the king's canopic equipment. His internal organs had been preserved separately as part of the mummification process, protected for the afterlife. Nearby were model boats, statues, boxes, and countless ritual objects. 2 tiny coffins found in the treasury contained the remains of 2 stillborn or premature infants, generally interpreted as daughters of Tutankhamun. Their presence transformed the tomb from a display of royal wealth into something more personal and tragic. The young king and queen may have hoped for children who would continue their dynasty, but no surviving heir followed Tutankhamun onto the throne. As the years of excavation continued, the scale of the discovery became clear. More than 5,000 objects were catalogued from the tomb. Some were spectacular masterpieces of royal craftsmanship. Others were ordinary items made extraordinary by their survival. There were jars that once contained food and wine, linen garments, gloves, sandals, headrests, musical instruments, board games, weapons, tools, jewellery and containers for cosmetics. There were chariots that might once have carried the king across palace grounds or hunting landscapes. There were bows that could be held in the hand and furniture upon which someone had once sat more than 3,000 years earlier. Together, these objects created something rare. Not simply the burial of a pharaoh, but an enormous collection of material from one moment in ancient Egyptian history. News of the discovery spread around the world. Newspapers followed every development. Crowds travelled to Egypt. Tutankhamun became an international sensation, even though his reign had been relatively short and historically less influential than those of rulers such as Rameses II or Thutmose III. The boy king's fame came after death. His forgotten name was suddenly everywhere, and ancient Egyptian designs influenced jewellery, fashion, architecture, cinema, and popular culture. But fame brought another story with it, one darker than the glittering gold of the tomb. In April 1923, only months after the burial chamber was opened, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo after an infected mosquito bite led to serious illness. Newspapers quickly connected his death to the tomb. Stories began circulating about mysterious warnings, supernatural punishments, and a supposed curse placed upon anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. Other deaths connected, sometimes very loosely, to people associated with the excavation were added to the legend. Soon the world was asking whether the young king, silent for more than 3,000 years, had somehow taken revenge on those who entered his tomb. The curse of Tutankhamun was becoming almost as famous as Tutankhamun himself. The idea of a pharaoh's curse captured the imagination of the public almost immediately. Newspapers competed to publish increasingly dramatic stories, and the mysterious atmosphere surrounding ancient Egypt made the legend easy to believe. According to popular versions of the tale, anyone who entered Tutankhamun's tomb would suffer illness, misfortune, or death. Some reports even claimed that a warning had been found near the entrance threatening those who disturbed the king. Yet no reliable archaeological record confirms that such a curse was written at the doorway. Ancient Egyptian tombs sometimes contained protective texts and magical formulas, but the famous warnings associated with Tutankhamun were largely products of later storytelling. Lord Carnarvon's death nevertheless gave the legend extraordinary power. He died on April 5, 1923 in Cairo, several months after entering the tomb. The immediate cause was connected to an infected mosquito bite that became serious rather than anything supernatural. Still, newspapers noticed every strange detail. One story claimed that the lights of Cairo went out around the time of his death. Another claimed that his dog in England howled and died at approximately the same moment. These stories travelled rapidly across the world, becoming part of the mythology surrounding the tomb. Over time, whenever someone connected with the excavation died, the event could be added to the supposed curse, even when that person died many years later. But one important fact complicated the legend. Howard Carter himself, the man who had opened the tomb and spent years working among its contents, lived until 1939. He was 64 when he died, more than 16 years after the discovery. Many others who entered the tomb also lived for decades. Statistical examinations of those involved have not provided convincing evidence of an unusual pattern of early death. The curse became a powerful story, but evidence for a supernatural force remains absent. The real mysteries of Tutankhamun were found not in curses but in his body. As scientific technology advanced, researchers returned again and again to the mummy, hoping to answer a question that had remained unresolved since the tomb was opened. Why had a young king died before reaching the age of 20? Early examinations produced several theories. Some researchers wondered whether Tutankhamun had suffered a fatal accident. Others proposed that he had been murdered during a period of political instability. For years, a damaged area at the back of his skull encouraged speculation that he might have received a deadly blow to the head. The idea was irresistible. A teenage pharaoh, a powerful royal court, no surviving heir, and perhaps ambitious officials waiting to seize the throne. It sounded like the beginning of an ancient murder mystery. Later CT scans, however, weakened the murder theory. The damage inside the skull appeared more likely to have occurred during the mummification process or later handling of the body rather than from a fatal attack. Attention then shifted to other parts of the mummy. Researchers identified a fracture in the left leg, leading to speculation that an accident may have contributed to his death. Some imagined a chariot crash, perhaps during hunting or battle. Yet there is no definitive evidence that Tutankhamun died in such an accident. Modern investigations also revealed that the young king had significant physical problems. His left foot showed abnormalities, including a condition affecting the bones. The numerous walking sticks found in his tomb suddenly seemed more important. They may not have been merely symbols of status. Some could have been objects he actually needed during life. Then came another remarkable clue. Genetic studies published in 2010 reported evidence associated with the parasite that causes malaria. Researchers suggested that Tutankhamun experienced malaria infections and proposed that illness, combined with his physical condition and possibly the leg injury, may have contributed to his death. Even this explanation is not universally accepted as the final answer. More than 3,000 years have passed, and ancient remains rarely preserve every detail necessary to reconstruct the final days of a person's life. The mystery remains open, although science has eliminated some of the more dramatic theories. Genetics also offered clues about Tutankhamun's family. DNA studies suggested that the mummy identified as Akhenaten's likely remains was Tutankhamun's father, while his mother appears to have been another member of the same royal family. The results indicated that his parents were closely related, probably brother and sister. Royal families in ancient Egypt sometimes married within the family to preserve dynastic legitimacy, but repeated close relationships could increase the likelihood of inherited health problems. Tutankhamun's physical difficulties may have been influenced by this family history, although researchers continue to debate exactly which conditions he experienced. His wife, Ankhesenamun, was also closely related to him. Their two daughters did not survive infancy, and their tiny bodies were buried with their father. With Tutankhamun's death, the direct royal line associated with Akhenaten was approaching its end. The throne passed to Ai, an older court official who had already held considerable influence. Ai's reign was brief, and he was eventually followed by Horemheb, a military leader who worked to erase much of the memory of Akhenaten's controversial period. Names were removed from official records, monuments were altered, and the rulers associated with the Amarna era were often excluded from later king lists. Ironically, this attempt to diminish Tutankhamun's memory may have helped preserve his tomb. Later tomb builders and robbers may simply have lost track of where the young king had been buried. Above ground, his name faded. Below ground, his possessions remained. For more than 3,000 years, the golden mask rested in darkness. The chariots stood silent. The royal throne gathered dust. Food prepared for the afterlife remained sealed in containers. Sandals waited for feet that would never walk again. The king's body lay inside layers of shrines and coffins, while civilizations rose and fell above him. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. Greek-speaking rulers governed from Alexandria. Rome absorbed the kingdom. Christianity spread through Egypt, followed centuries later by Islam. Languages changed, cities expanded, and generations passed without knowing what lay beneath a small area of the Valley of the Kings. That long silence is part of what makes the discovery so extraordinary. Archaeologists had not simply found gold. They had opened a time capsule. The tomb contained evidence of craftsmanship, religion, politics, clothing, transportation, food, warfare, entertainment, and royal family life from more than 3 millennia ago. Even the smallest objects could reveal something. Sandals showed how ancient craftsmen worked with leather and plant fibers. Wine jars preserved inscriptions recording their contents and origins. Chests displayed scenes of royal power. Jewelry revealed extraordinary skill in working gold, stone, glass, and coloured materials. Weapons offered clues about international connections and technology. One object became particularly fascinating to modern researchers: a dagger buried with Tutankhamun. Its blade was made of iron at a time when iron objects were still rare in Egypt. Modern analysis showed that the metal contained high levels of nickel and cobalt consistent with meteoritic iron. In other words, the material had originated from a meteorite that fell from the sky. Long before iron became common, ancient craftsmen had transformed metal from space into a weapon fit for a king. To the people who made it, such material may have carried extraordinary significance. To modern researchers, it demonstrated that the treasures of Tutankhamun were valuable not simply because they contained gold, but because they preserved technologies and materials that tell us how connected and sophisticated the ancient world could be. Other objects told quieter stories. The golden throne showed the king and queen beneath the rays of Aten, preserving artistic traces of the religious period that Tutankhamun's reign later moved away from. Small statues represented gods and the king in various forms. Model boats were intended to assist his journey through the afterlife. Food and drink were provided because Egyptians believed the dead would continue to require nourishment. Clothing and jewelry allowed the king to remain properly dressed for eternity. Every corner of the tomb reflected the belief that death was a transition rather than an ending. Yet perhaps the most recognizable object remained the golden mask. It transformed the face of a teenager who ruled briefly into the timeless face of ancient Egypt. Millions of people who know little about Tutankhamun's reign recognize that calm expression immediately. The mask helped create a strange contrast between the historical Tutankhamun and the modern one. During his lifetime, he was a young ruler overshadowed by the dramatic reign of his father and by more powerful pharaohs who came before and after him. In death, however, he surpassed almost all of them in fame. Ramesses II ruled for decades and built monuments across Egypt. Thutmose III led campaigns that expanded Egyptian power. Khufu left behind the Great Pyramid. But it was Tutankhamun, the boy king whose name nearly disappeared, who became the face of the pharaohs for much of the modern world. And as scientists continued examining his remains and archaeologists studied every object from his tomb, another question began to grow. Had Howard Carter truly found everything? Or could the walls of KV-62 still be hiding secrets that no one had yet discovered? The possibility that Tutankhamun's tomb might contain hidden chambers captured the world's attention nearly a century after Howard Carter first entered it. The mystery began with an unusual observation. Some researchers studying high-resolution images of the burial chamber believed they could see faint lines beneath the painted walls, shapes that appeared almost like sealed doorways. If those lines really marked entrances, then perhaps KV-62 was larger than anyone had imagined. One theory suggested that Tutankhamun's burial might have been placed inside part of an earlier tomb, and that additional rooms could remain sealed beyond the walls. The idea became even more exciting because of the young king's connection to one of ancient Egypt's most famous women, Queen Nefertiti. Nefertiti had been the wife of Akhenaten, and a central figure during the religious revolution that transformed Egypt before Tutankhamun's reign. Her elegant painted bust, discovered at Amarna in 1912, later became one of the most recognizable images from the ancient world. Yet despite her fame, her final resting place has never been securely identified. Could Nefertiti somehow be buried behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb? The suggestion sounded extraordinary. If true, it could become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries since 1922. Researchers used radar and other non-invasive technologies to investigate the walls without damaging the priceless paintings. Different surveys produced conflicting interpretations. Some appeared to suggest possible spaces or unusual features beyond the chamber, while later investigations failed to confirm the existence of a hidden room. The mystery remains fascinating, but there is currently no solid evidence that Nefertiti's tomb lies behind Tutankhamun's walls. The episode demonstrated something important about archaeology. Even a tomb studied for more than a century can continue to generate new questions. Modern researchers can examine ancient sites using technologies Carter could never have imagined. CT scanners can look inside mummies without unwrapping them. DNA analysis can investigate biological relationships. Chemical tests can identify pigments, oils, resins, food, and metals. Digital imaging can reveal details nearly invisible to the human eye. Each generation can return to the same evidence and ask questions that earlier archaeologists were unable to answer. Tutankhamun's mummy itself has undergone this transformation in the way it is studied. Early investigators physically handled and separated parts of the remains to examine them. Today, scientists can create detailed images of bones and internal structures while leaving much of the body undisturbed. These examinations have helped reconstruct the young king's physical condition, although many details remain debated. We cannot know his voice, his personality, or exactly what he thought about the enormous responsibilities placed upon him as a child. We cannot know whether he was frightened by illness, whether he enjoyed riding in chariots, or how deeply he loved Ankhesenamun. Archaeology gives us objects and bodies, but the private thoughts of people who lived thousands of years ago are much harder to recover. Still, some objects bring us unusually close to the human being behind the title of Pharaoh. His clothing was made for a real body. His sandals carried signs of use. His walking sticks may have supported him as he moved. His gaming boards suggest moments of entertainment. His bows, gloves, and equipment belong to a young man surrounded by the privileges and expectations of royalty. Even food was placed inside his tomb, including meat, bread, fruit, and wine, because those preparing the burial believed he would need provisions beyond death. To understand why so much was buried with him, we must enter the Egyptian vision of the afterlife. Egyptians believed a person consisted of more than the physical body. Different spiritual aspects of an individual had to survive and function after death, while the body needed to remain recognizable and protected. The tomb became a carefully prepared eternal home. Images, spells, amulets, offerings, and sacred rituals were intended to help the deceased overcome dangers and join the divine world. For a pharaoh, death also meant becoming closely associated with gods such as Osiris, ruler of the dead, while continuing a cosmic role beyond earthly kingship. This explains why Tutankhamun was surrounded by layers of protection. The shrines around his sarcophagus created sacred barriers. Coffins enclosed his body. Amulets were placed among his linen wrappings. Protective goddesses appeared around his burial equipment. Texts provided magical assistance for the journey ahead. Nothing was simply decoration. Gold itself had powerful associations. It did not tarnish like many other metals and was linked with the divine, particularly the brilliance of the sun. Covering the king with gold was therefore not merely a display of wealth. It helped present him as an eternal, transformed being. For those who buried Tutankhamun, the golden mask was not intended to become a museum masterpiece viewed by millions of tourists. It was meant to remain hidden forever. This is one of the great paradoxes of the tomb. Everything that makes it famous today was created with the expectation that almost nobody would ever see it again. The doors were sealed, the corridors were blocked, the king was placed inside his coffins and the living departed. The success of the burial depended partly upon silence and secrecy. Yet 3,000 years later, the exact opposite happened. Tutankhamun became one of the most viewed, photographed, studied, and discussed individuals from antiquity. Exhibitions of his treasures attracted enormous crowds around the world. Generations encountered ancient Egypt through the image of his mask. Children learned his name in school. Books, documentaries, films, jewellery, advertisements, and popular culture turned the forgotten king into a global icon. The discovery also transformed Howard Carter's life. He had spent years pursuing a tomb that many believed did not exist. After finding it, he devoted much of the next decade to recording and conserving its contents. The work was painstaking. Removing the treasures was not a matter of simply carrying gold out of a room. Objects that had survived thousands of years could deteriorate rapidly once exposed to changing air, humidity, light, and handling. Conservators worked to stabilize fragile surfaces before transportation. Each item's original position mattered because its location could help explain the burial ritual. Carter's detailed records remain valuable to researchers today. But the excavation also occurred during a period when Egypt's relationship with foreign archaeologists was changing. The treasures became symbols not only of ancient history, but of modern Egyptian cultural heritage. Unlike many earlier discoveries that were divided between excavators and Egyptian authorities, the objects from Tutankhamun's tomb remained in Egypt. Today, the collection belongs to Egypt and represents one of the country's most celebrated archaeological legacies. The story therefore reaches far beyond the life of a teenage pharaoh. It connects the world of ancient priests and craftsmen with modern archaeology, science, museums, tourism, politics, and questions about who should preserve and control the material remains of the past. And through all of this, Tutankhamun himself remains strangely silent. His treasures can tell us how he was buried. His bones can reveal clues about his health. Inscriptions can record his titles and royal actions, but the final days of his life remain hidden. Somewhere around 1323 BC, while still barely an adult, the young king became seriously ill or injured. The people around him could not save him. His death began a hurried journey toward a tomb that was never expected to become famous. Yet it was precisely his early death, his forgotten reign, and the survival of that modest royal tomb that would ensure something no Egyptian priest could have predicted. More than 3,000 years later, the world would still be speaking the name Tutankhamun. And yet the name Tutankhamun almost vanished completely. After his death, Egypt entered another period of political change, and the rulers who followed had little reason to preserve the memory of the young king or the controversial family from which he came. I, who succeeded Tutankhamun, ruled only briefly. Horemheb later took the throne and presented himself as the ruler who restored order after the religious disruption of the Amarna period. Under his reign, traces of Akhenaten and his successors were increasingly removed from monuments and official history. Tutankhamun's name disappeared from some later royal lists, and buildings associated with his family were dismantled or reused. Stones carrying royal inscriptions could be placed inside newer structures, hidden from view for centuries. To later generations, it was almost as if the boy king had never ruled at all. But beneath the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, his burial remained. The forgotten king had become protected by the very process that erased him from history. If his reign had been remembered as one of Egypt's greatest, perhaps generations of treasure hunters would have searched more aggressively for his tomb. Instead, the entrance disappeared beneath debris, and the valley slowly concealed its secret. Above the buried staircase, workers came and went. Other tombs were constructed nearby. Floods occasionally carried rubble through the valley. Sand, stone, and human activity transformed the landscape until the entrance to KV-62 was no longer visible. Tutankhamun slept beneath a world that had forgotten his name. When Carter finally revealed the tomb in 1922, the objects inside allowed historians to rebuild pieces of that lost world. One of the most remarkable aspects of the collection was the extraordinary quality of Egyptian craftsmanship. Goldsmiths had shaped thin sheets of precious metal into elaborate surfaces. Carpenters had created furniture from wood, ivory, ebony, and other materials. Artists had filled objects with images of gods, animals, plants, enemies, and royal ceremonies. Jewellery makers combined gold with colourful stones and glass to produce necklaces, bracelets, rings, collars, and protective amulets. Some materials had travelled enormous distances before reaching Egypt, revealing connections between the Nile Valley and neighbouring regions. The treasures were therefore evidence of an international world. Egypt exchanged goods, gifts, knowledge, and political messages with kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Precious materials could arrive through trade or diplomacy, then pass into royal workshops, where skilled craftsmen transformed them into objects worthy of a pharaoh. Tutankhamun's tomb preserved this network in miniature. Even objects that looked purely Egyptian could contain materials whose journeys had begun far beyond the Nile. Among the most fascinating pieces was a pectoral decorated with a scarab-like form made from yellow desert glass. This unusual material originated in the Sahara, where an extreme event in the distant past produced natural glass from desert sand. Thousands of years later, Egyptian craftsmen shaped that material into royal jewellery. Alongside the meteoritic iron dagger, it creates an almost poetic image of Tutankhamun surrounded by materials connected to both desert and sky. Yet the objects were not chosen simply because they were rare. They belonged to a carefully organised religious universe. The scarab represented transformation and renewal. The rising sun symbolised rebirth. Protective eyes guarded against danger. Images of gods surrounded the king. The cobra represented royal authority and divine protection. To modern visitors, the tomb may look like an unimaginable collection of wealth. To the Egyptians who created it, every symbol could carry a purpose in eternity. The burial chamber walls themselves tell part of this story. Unlike the extensive decoration found in some larger royal tombs, Tutankhamun's burial chamber contains relatively limited painted scenes. One wall shows the funeral procession, another depicts the king in the presence of gods. He appears performing an important funerary ritual for Tutankhamun, a scene that also reinforces A's position as the new ruler. The paintings are striking not because they cover every surface, but because they reveal the transition of royal power at the moment of death. One king was entering the afterlife, while another was taking his place among the living. The speed with which the burial appears to have been prepared has encouraged generations of researchers to wonder what happened in the weeks after Tutankhamun died. The normal royal succession had been disrupted. Ankhesenamun suddenly found herself without a husband and apparently without a surviving child. An extraordinary group of ancient documents from outside Egypt may preserve an echo of her desperation. Hittite records describe an Egyptian queen whose husband had died and who wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, asking him to send one of his sons to become her husband. She reportedly insisted that she did not wish to marry one of her own subjects. The identity of this queen is debated, but Ankhesenamun is one of the leading candidates. If she was indeed the woman behind the letters, the situation was remarkable. An Egyptian queen was asking a foreign king to send a prince who might become pharaoh. Suppiluliuma was suspicious and sent representatives to investigate. Eventually, according to the Hittite account, he sent his son Zananza toward Egypt. But the prince never reached his destination. He died or was killed on the journey. The circumstances remain unknown. If Ankhesenamun was involved, the episode would reveal just how uncertain the royal court became after Tutankhamun's death. Soon afterward, I became pharaoh. Ankhesenamun then largely disappeared from the historical record. Her ultimate fate remains one of the unanswered mysteries surrounding Tutankhamun's story. No securely identified tomb of the young queen has been found, and we cannot say with certainty where or when she died. The boy king's death therefore left behind more than a sealed tomb. It marked the collapse of a royal family whose final years remain filled with gaps. This uncertainty helps explain why Tutankhamun continues to fascinate researchers. His tomb provided an overwhelming abundance of physical evidence, yet his life remains strangely incomplete. We possess his throne, but not his thoughts. We can examine his body, but cannot reconstruct his final conversation. We know what was placed beside him for eternity, but not exactly what killed him. We know the names of people around him, yet their relationships and ambitions remain partly hidden. Every answer seems to reveal another question. Even the famous golden mask has generated debate. Scholars have examined its construction, inscriptions, and design in extraordinary detail. Questions have been raised about whether every element was originally made specifically for Tutankhamun, or whether some burial equipment may have been adapted from objects prepared for another royal person. Such reuse would not necessarily be surprising if the king's death occurred unexpectedly. A royal burial required enormous resources, and there may not have been enough time to manufacture every object from the beginning. Some items in the tomb appear to have been altered for Tutankhamun, suggesting that the burial was assembled from a mixture of possessions, newly created equipment, and objects originally intended for others. This possibility makes the tomb even more interesting. Rather than a perfectly planned monument prepared over decades, KV-62 may preserve the urgency of a court suddenly confronted with the death of a teenage ruler. Craftsmen, priests, officials, and embalmers had only a limited period to prepare the king for eternity. Objects had to be gathered, rituals had to be completed, a tomb had to be ready. Political decisions about succession unfolded at the same time. Somewhere during those 70 days of preparation, the living world around Tutankhamun was changing rapidly. And then the final ceremony arrived. Imagine the procession moving through the dry landscape toward the Valley of the Kings. Priests carried sacred objects. Officials followed the royal body. Food, furniture, clothing, weapons, and treasures were transported toward the tomb. Ankhesenamun may have watched as her young husband disappeared into the burial chambers. Ritual words were spoken. Incense filled the air. The king's mummy was enclosed within layers of gold, wood, stone, linen, resin, prayers, and symbols. One by one, the barriers between Tutankhamun and the living world were closed. The shrines surrounded the sarcophagus. The coffins protected the mummy. The doorway was sealed. Workers filled the corridor. The final entrance disappeared behind stone and plaster. Then the footsteps faded away. Silence returned to the valley. The Egyptians believed their king had begun a journey into eternity. They could not know that more than 3,000 years later, another procession would descend the same staircase, not to bury Tutankhamun, but to bring his forgotten world back into the light. When Howard Carter and his team began bringing Tutankhamun's possessions into the light, they were doing more than emptying an ancient tomb. They were slowly reconstructing a life that history had almost erased. Each object passed through the hands of photographers, conservators, artists, and specialists before it could safely leave the valley. Some pieces were strong enough to survive transportation with little difficulty, while others were so fragile that even a slight movement threatened to destroy them. Wooden objects had dried for centuries. Fabrics could crumble at a touch. Decorative surfaces sometimes lifted away from the material beneath them. The excavation therefore continued for years, long after the excitement of the first discovery had spread around the world. Carter understood that the position of an object could be almost as important as the object itself. A necklace lying beside a coffin, a jar placed in a corner, or a statue facing a doorway might reveal something about the rituals performed during the burial. Harry Burton's photographs preserved these arrangements before they were disturbed. Through his camera we can still see the antechamber much as Carter first encountered it, crowded with beds, chariots, boxes, statues, and gold. These photographs became a second kind of time capsule, preserving a moment that disappeared as soon as excavation began. Outside the tomb, public fascination continued to grow. Visitors arrived in Egypt hoping to witness the discovery for themselves. Newspapers published stories about the treasures, the king, the curse, and every new object brought from the chambers. Tutankhamun became a celebrity more than 3,000 years after his death. His image appeared in art and fashion. Egyptian motifs decorated jewelry, furniture, theatres, and buildings. The discovery arrived at a time when mass newspapers, photography, and cinema could carry the story around the world with unprecedented speed. People who would never visit Egypt could still imagine Carter's candle entering the darkness and illuminating gold that had not been seen since antiquity. But behind the excitement was a more difficult question. Who did the treasures belong to? Archaeology in Egypt had long been shaped by foreign expeditions, collectors, museums, and political influence. Many Egyptian antiquities had left the country during earlier generations. By the 1920s, attitudes were changing, and Egyptian authorities increasingly asserted control over the nation's ancient heritage. Tutankhamun's treasures remained in Egypt, becoming part of a national collection, rather than being divided in the manner that had sometimes occurred with earlier excavations. This decision helped keep the extraordinary burial assemblage together. It also meant that Tutankhamun's story would remain deeply connected to the land where he had lived and died. Over the decades, selected objects from the tomb travelled temporarily in international exhibitions, attracting enormous crowds. For many visitors, seeing the golden mask was their first direct encounter with ancient Egypt. Yet the real importance of the collection extended far beyond gold. Researchers examined the materials used to create the objects and discovered evidence of sophisticated craftsmanship. Ancient artisans understood how to work with metals, stone, wood, glass, pigments, leather, linen, and organic materials. A single piece of jewellery might combine several substances gathered from distant places and shaped using techniques passed down through generations. The tomb revealed a society capable of organising enormous networks of labour and knowledge around the royal household. Consider the chariots found inside KV-62. They had been dismantled so they could fit within the crowded rooms. Some may have served ceremonial purposes, while others could have been used for hunting or transportation. Their construction required precise woodworking and an understanding of how to produce a vehicle that was light enough to move quickly, yet strong enough to carry riders over uneven ground. Chariots had transformed warfare and royal display across the ancient Near East, and Egypt had incorporated them into its military culture centuries before Tutankhamun was born. Images of pharaohs charging enemies from chariots became symbols of royal power. Whether the young Tutankhamun personally used every chariot buried with him is impossible to know, but their presence linked him to the ideal image of the warrior king. Weapons inside the tomb carried similar meaning. Bows, arrows, shields, daggers, and other equipment presented the pharaoh as a protector of Egypt. Some objects may have been ceremonial, but others show evidence suggesting practical use. Tutankhamun lived in a world where Egyptian influence was challenged abroad, and surviving inscriptions from his reign refer to military activity. Because he was so young and may have experienced physical difficulties, historians debate how personally involved he could have been in campaigns. Royal art did not necessarily record events like a modern photograph. It presented the king as Egypt believed a king should appear: strong, victorious, divinely protected, and capable of defeating chaos. This distinction between image and reality appears throughout Tutankhamun's story. His golden mask presents an ideal, timeless ruler, not necessarily an exact portrait of a sick or physically vulnerable teenager. Temple scenes show a powerful pharaoh performing sacred duties, even though experienced officials probably played major roles in governing during his childhood. Royal inscriptions speak in the language of certainty and order, while the political situation surrounding his family may have been far more complicated. To understand Tutankhamun, we must constantly move between these two worlds: the perfect king created by Egyptian ideology and the real young man whose body still carries evidence of human frailty. Modern science brought that human side closer. In 1968, X-rays were taken of the mummy, beginning a new period of medical investigation. Decades later, CT scanning produced far more detailed images. Researchers could examine the skeleton without physically dismantling the remains again. They studied the skull, spine, limbs, feet, and other structures, searching for signs of injury or disease. The findings challenged older theories while generating new ones. A supposed blow to the head became less convincing as a cause of death. Attention moved toward the leg-foot genetic relationships and infectious disease. But science did not transform Tutankhamun's death into a solved case. Instead, it demonstrated how difficult it is to diagnose a person who died more than 3,000 years ago. The body had undergone mummification, chemical treatment, centuries of environmental change, ancient disturbance, and early 20th century examination. Damage could occur at many different stages. Even DNA recovered from ancient mummies presents technical challenges because heat, contamination, degradation, and embalming materials can affect preservation. Researchers therefore continue to debate interpretations of the evidence. Some accept malaria and physical complications as important factors. Others caution that detecting a pathogen does not prove it caused death. The leg injury remains intriguing, but its timing and significance are uncertain. What can be said with confidence is simpler. Tutankhamun died unexpectedly while still very young, and the precise sequence of events leading to his death remains unknown. That uncertainty has allowed imagination to fill the gaps. Murder, chariot accidents, inherited disorders, infection, political conspiracy, and even supernatural explanations have all appeared in books and documentaries. The truth may have been far less dramatic. In an age without antibiotics, modern surgery or intensive medical care, an infection or injury that is treatable today could become life-threatening. Malaria was present in ancient Egypt. Accidents happened. Young people died from illnesses that modern medicine might control. A pharaoh possessed extraordinary wealth and access to the best care his society could provide, but kingship could not protect him from every disease. Ancient Egyptian medicine itself combined practical observation with religious belief. Physicians used plants, minerals, bandages, splints, and other treatments, while spells and appeals to divine forces could accompany medical care. Surviving medical papyri show that Egyptian healers accumulated considerable knowledge, especially about injuries and symptoms. Yet their understanding of infection, genetics, and disease was naturally limited compared with modern medicine. If Tutankhamun became seriously ill, palace physicians may have recognized his symptoms without possessing the means to save him. Somewhere inside the royal residence, perhaps over a period of days or weeks, the court would have realized that the young king was dying. The atmosphere must have changed rapidly. Officials who had served him now faced a future without him. Priests prepared for the rituals required after a royal death. Craftsmen may have received urgent instructions to finish burial equipment. The question of succession became unavoidable. Ankhesenamun, still a young woman herself, faced the loss of both husband and political security. When Tutankhamun finally died, the machinery of royal burial began immediately. His body had to be preserved, his tomb had to be prepared, thousands of objects had to be assembled. The rituals needed to transform the dead king into an eternal being had to proceed according to tradition. Yet while everyone worked to preserve Tutankhamun forever, his earthly memory was already beginning to disappear. Within generations, his name would be pushed into obscurity. Within centuries, almost no one would know where he lay, and eventually even the civilization that buried him would transform beyond recognition. The irony is profound. The pharaohs built enormous monuments because they feared being forgotten. Tutankhamun left behind nothing comparable to the Great Pyramid or the colossal temples of Ramesses II. His tomb was small, his reign brief, and his historical legacy nearly erased. Yet because his burial survived when so many greater tombs were robbed, he achieved a kind of immortality that the builders of larger monuments could never have predicted. Today, the young king who almost disappeared from history stands at the center of our imagination of ancient Egypt, while countless rulers who were far more powerful during their lifetimes are known mainly to specialists. Perhaps that is the strangest treasure Howard Carter found beneath the Valley of the Kings. Not gold, not jewels, and not the famous mask, but the return of a forgotten human being. Tutankhamun had entered his tomb as a teenager, surrounded by people who believed his spirit would live forever. 3,000 years later, when a small opening was made through a sealed doorway and candlelight entered the darkness, his name began a second life, one that would carry him farther through time than anyone standing at his funeral could ever have imagined. The rediscovery of Tutankhamun also changed the way the modern world imagined archaeology itself. Before Carter entered KV 62, excavations had already uncovered extraordinary temples, tombs, statues, and inscriptions across Egypt. But the discovery of an almost complete royal burial created a story unlike anything the public had experienced before. It had suspense, darkness, forgotten royalty, unimaginable wealth, and a young king whose face seemed to emerge directly from the ancient past. For years, people followed the excavation almost as though events were unfolding inside a living palace rather than a silent tomb. Every chamber offered another surprise. Every chest might contain something unseen for thousands of years. Yet for archaeologists, the true value of the tomb was not measured by the amount of gold. What mattered was context. Most royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been heavily robbed in antiquity. Their treasures had been removed, scattered, melted down, or reused. When archaeologists later entered those tombs, they often found fragments of what had once been elaborate burials. Tutankhamun's tomb offered something very different. Although ancient thieves had entered parts of it, thousands of objects remained together. This allowed researchers to study not only individual masterpieces, but an entire royal burial collection. A simple wooden box could be examined beside the jewellery stored near it. A chariot could be studied alongside the equipment associated with royal travel. Food containers could be connected with ideas about nourishment in the afterlife. The tomb became a vast archive without pages, written instead in gold, wood, stone, linen, leather, glass, pigment, and human remains. Even the king's sandals became meaningful. Some were decorated with images of Egypt's enemies beneath his feet. Every step the pharaoh symbolically took represented the defeat of those who threatened the kingdom. Such imagery reveals how deeply political ideas entered everyday royal objects. A sandal was not merely footwear. A chair was not merely furniture. A staff was not merely something to hold. In the royal world, objects could communicate power, religion, protection, and identity at the same time. The same was true of Tutankhamun's jewellery. Amulets placed on his body were positioned according to beliefs about protection and rebirth. Scarabs represented renewal. Sacred eyes offered protection. Images of gods connected the dead king with divine forces. Gold reflected the eternal flesh of the gods in Egyptian religious imagination. When priests wrapped Tutankhamun's body, they were constructing a protected sacred form designed to survive forever. Layer after layer of linen separated the young man's physical remains from the outside world. Between those layers, amulets and jewellery were placed according to ritual traditions. Resins helped preserve and sanctify the body. Then came the mask, coffins, sarcophagus, shrines, chamber, corridor, and sealed entrance. The burial was like a series of protective worlds placed one inside another. At the centre lay a teenager. Around him stood the entire religious power of Egyptian kingship. Modern visitors often focus on the beauty of the golden objects, but the Egyptians who buried Tutankhamun would probably have understood them very differently. The tomb was not meant to be a treasure vault. It was a functioning environment for eternity. Model boats could carry the king through the next world. Shabti figures could perform labour on his behalf. Food sustained him. Clothing dressed him. Weapons protected him. Games offered recreation. Beds and chairs provided comfort. Sacred texts guided him through dangers that Egyptians believed awaited beyond death. The tomb was a continuation of life transformed into something eternal. This belief explains why the robbery of a tomb was such a serious act. A thief was not simply stealing wealth. From the Egyptian religious perspective, removing burial equipment could threaten the deceased person's eternal existence. Yet tomb robbery became a major problem, particularly during periods when political authority weakened and economic conditions deteriorated. Records from ancient Egypt describe investigations into tomb robberies, including testimony from suspects and officials. The Valley of the Kings was never completely beyond human greed. Tutankhamun's burial appears to have been entered not long after it was sealed. Ancient thieves may have taken smaller, valuable objects that could be carried quickly. Officials then restored some order and resealed the entrance. Somehow, after these early intrusions, the tomb escaped the systematic destruction suffered by many other royal burials. One possible reason was its location. Later construction activity nearby covered the entrance with debris. Eventually, workers' huts were built above the area. A person walking through the valley centuries later might have passed directly over Tutankhamun without knowing that a king and thousands of treasures rested beneath the ground. That accidental concealment lasted longer than any guard could have. When Carter's workers removed those ancient remains in 1922, they were reversing centuries of geological and human activity, one basket of rubble at a time. The first staircase step must have seemed almost insignificant against the scale of the valley. Yet it opened a path between two worlds separated by more than 3,000 years. Carter's famous first view into the antechamber has become legendary, but imagine the silence before he made that opening. Behind the wall stood furniture placed there during the Bronze Age. The last people to arrange many of those objects had lived before classical Greece, before the Roman Empire, and long before much of recorded European history. Their fingerprints may once have touched surfaces that remained unseen until the 20th century. The air inside had been enclosed through countless generations. Then a small hole appeared, and modern light entered. This moment helps explain why Tutankhamun's story remains powerful, even after a century of research. It compresses an enormous span of time into one doorway. On one side stands Howard Carter in 1922. On the other stands the world of approximately 1323 BC. Only a thin wall separated them. Once that wall was opened, the past became physically present. Yet despite everything recovered, Tutankhamun remained surrounded by absences. We do not possess a diary written by him. We cannot hear him describe his childhood. We do not know how much political authority he personally exercised as he grew older. We cannot say exactly what relationship he had with the officials who governed around him. We cannot reconstruct the precise moment of his death. We do not know with certainty what happened to Ankhesenamun afterward. Even the identity and fate of several people surrounding the royal family remain debated. This uncertainty is not a weakness of archaeology. It is part of what makes the discipline fascinating. Archaeologists rarely receive complete stories. They find fragments and attempt to understand how those fragments fit together. A broken inscription, a bone, a sealed jar, a discarded tool, or the position of a doorway can alter an interpretation built over decades. New technology can reopen old questions. New excavations elsewhere can provide missing context. Tutankhamun's story therefore continues to evolve. What Carter believed in the 1920s is not identical to what researchers understand today, and future discoveries may change the picture again. Perhaps new evidence will clarify the king's family. Perhaps advances in medical imaging will reveal more about his physical condition. Perhaps another tomb from the same royal family will eventually be discovered, containing texts that illuminate the confusing years surrounding his reign. Somewhere beneath the Egyptian landscape, evidence may still exist that could answer questions we've been asking for generations. This possibility is especially compelling because Tutankhamun himself demonstrated how much can remain hidden, even in a place that archaeologists believe they know well. Before November 1922, many researchers had already explored the Valley of the Kings. Carter nevertheless found an entire royal burial beneath their feet. The lesson was simple. Absence of discovery does not always mean absence of evidence. Sometimes history is still there, covered by a few meters of rubble, waiting for the right person to look in the right place. And so the story of Tutankhamun is not only a story about ancient Egypt, it is also a story about memory, forgetting, and rediscovery. A child became king. A young man died. His body was prepared for eternity. His name faded. His tomb vanished from sight. Empires came and went above him. Then, thousands of years later, a staircase appeared beneath the dust, and the forgotten pharaoh returned to the world. By the time the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb was completed, the boy king had become more famous than he had ever been during his lifetime. Yet the deeper researchers looked into his world, the more they realized that his story was connected to one of the most dramatic transformations in Egyptian history. To understand the young pharaoh, we must return briefly to the generation before him, when his probable father, Akhenaten, challenged traditions that had shaped Egypt for centuries. Akhenaten elevated the Aten, represented by the radiant disk of the sun, to an extraordinary position within royal religion. Temples dedicated to traditional gods lost influence, especially those connected with Amun. The royal court moved to a newly constructed city called Akhetaten, modern Amarna, built on land that had not previously been a major royal capital. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, workshops, and homes appeared in the desert. For a brief period, this new city became the center of Egyptian power. Art also changed. Royal images became unusually intimate and distinctive. Akhenaten was shown with features unlike the idealized forms of earlier kings. Scenes depicted the royal family together beneath the rays of Aten, sometimes showing parents and children in affectionate moments. Tutankhamun was born into the shadow of this revolution. When Akhenaten died, however, the system he created began to unravel. The young Tutankhamun inherited not simply a throne, but a kingdom recovering from religious and political disruption. Experienced officials around him played crucial roles. Two figures in particular, A and Horemheb, would become important during and after his reign. I was a senior court official with deep connections to the royal household. Horemheb was a powerful military commander. Both men would eventually become pharaohs after Tutankhamun's death. During the boy king's reign, the restoration of traditional religion accelerated. A famous inscription known as the Restoration Stela describes temples that had fallen into neglect and sanctuaries that needed rebuilding. The message presented Tutankhamun as the ruler who restored order and returned the gods to their proper places. Whether a child personally designed this policy is doubtful, Advisors, priests, and officials almost certainly shaped major decisions, especially early in his reign. But as Tutankhamun grew older, he may have taken a more active role. Unfortunately, his death came before historians can clearly see what kind of adult ruler he might have become. His surviving monuments suggest a reign attempting to reconnect Egypt with its older traditions. Construction resumed at important religious centres. Images and inscriptions celebrated the restored relationship between the king and the gods. The royal court eventually left Ankhesenamun, and the city created by Akhenaten declined rapidly. Buildings were abandoned, materials were removed for reuse elsewhere. The extraordinary experiment of the Aten faded, while Amun once again became one of Egypt's most important gods. Tutankhamun's name itself preserved this transformation. Born Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten, he became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. His wife also changed her name from Ankhesenamun to Ankhesenamun. Names in ancient Egypt carried meaning, and these changes publicly announced a new direction for the monarchy. Yet traces of the previous period remained. Some objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb still carried artistic and religious features associated with Amarna. This mixture of old and new makes his burial especially valuable. It captures Egypt during a transition, when one royal vision was being replaced by another. His tomb therefore contains not only the possessions of a young king, but evidence of a civilization correcting its political and religious course. There is another reason the tomb is so revealing. Tutankhamun died before he could prepare a monumental burial over many years. Powerful pharaohs often began planning their tombs early in their reigns, allowing workers decades to carve corridors, chambers, texts, and elaborate decorations deep into the cliffs. Tutankhamun had no such luxury. His reign lasted roughly a decade, and much of it occurred while he was still a child. His sudden death appears to have forced the court to use a relatively modest tomb. KV-62 consists of a descending entrance, corridor, antechamber, annex, burial chamber, and treasury. Compared with the enormous tombs of some other rulers, it is surprisingly compact. This small size may have contributed to its survival. A grand entrance could attract attention. Tutankhamun's tomb was easier for later activity in the valley to conceal. The very circumstances that made his burial less impressive by royal standards ultimately helped preserve it. Inside, however, the court compensated for limited space by filling the chambers with extraordinary quantities of burial equipment. Objects were packed tightly together, chariots were dismantled, furniture was stacked, boxes filled remaining spaces. The great gilded shrines around the sarcophagus nearly touched the walls of the burial chamber. It was as though an entire royal world had been compressed into a few rooms. When Carter entered, he encountered the result of that compression. Thousands of objects occupying nearly every available area. Among them were more than 400 small figures known as shabti. Egyptians believed such figures could perform work for the deceased in the afterlife. If the king were called upon to labour in the fields of the next world, magical servants could answer in his place. Some shabtis were simple, while others were beautifully crafted and inscribed. Their presence illustrates how detailed Egyptian preparations for eternity could become. They did not merely imagine that the dead survived. They attempted to provide solutions for the practical problems that eternal existence might present. The same logic applied to food. Archaeologists found containers holding provisions for the king. Wine jars carried inscriptions that can reveal information such as the vineyard, producer, or year associated with their contents. Meat was prepared and preserved. Baskets and vessels held other supplies. These were offerings, but they were also evidence of daily life. Through a royal tomb, researchers can study what people ate, drank, wore, built, valued, and believed. One of the most moving discoveries was the presence of small objects that seemed connected to Tutankhamun's childhood. The pharaoh had been elevated into a divine royal figure after death, but he had only recently been a boy. He may have played games, learned royal ceremonies, practiced archery, listened to musicians, watched craftsmen, and travelled through palace gardens. The contrast between childhood and kingship must have been enormous. At an age when most children depended entirely on adults, Tutankhamun appeared before subjects as the ruler of Egypt. Ceremonial crowns, jewellery, staffs, and royal clothing transformed him into the visible centre of the state. Around him stood officials who understood government far better than he did. Somewhere within that carefully controlled world, a child had to learn how to become a pharaoh. We can imagine his mornings beginning with attendants preparing him for royal appearances. Priests might guide him through ceremonies whose words had been repeated for generations. Scribes brought documents and officials presented matters of administration. Foreign representatives arrived with gifts or requests. Military commanders reported from Egypt's borders. Craftsmen worked on royal projects in his name. Farmers hundreds of kilometres away might never see him, yet their taxes supported the temples and institutions connected with his authority. The Nile continued its annual rhythm, determining agriculture and shaping the lives of millions. While the young king occupied a position Egyptians associated with maintaining cosmic order itself. Whether Tutankhamun felt powerful, isolated, frightened, or privileged is beyond our evidence. Royal inscriptions rarely reveal vulnerability. They present certainty because certainty was part of kingship. The pharaoh defeats enemies. The pharaoh honours the gods. The pharaoh restores order. The human being behind that image remains hidden. His tomb, however, occasionally breaks through that distance. The throne showing Ankhesenamun touching her husband suggests tenderness within the royal household. Walking sticks suggest physical difficulty. The remains of their two daughters suggest personal loss. Objects made for a young body remind us how little time he had. These fragments do not give us his thoughts, but they allow us to see something beyond the golden mask. Tutankhamun was not born expecting to become archaeology's most famous pharaoh. He was born into a royal family undergoing extraordinary change, became king while still a child, inherited the consequences of his father's revolution, participated in restoring older traditions, married young, lost children, suffered physical problems, and died before adulthood had truly begun. His burial was prepared under pressure, his dynasty collapsed, and his name was nearly erased. If history had unfolded slightly differently, perhaps Carter would have found nothing. Ancient thieves might have returned and emptied KV-62. Later builders might have discovered it. Floodwater might have caused greater destruction. The tomb could have been identified centuries before archaeology developed careful methods of documentation. Instead, a remarkable chain of accidents preserved much of it until 1922. That survival is why we know Tutankhamun today. The gold attracted the world's attention, but beneath the gold lies a quieter story. The story of a young man caught between the ambitions of a royal family, the expectations of an ancient civilization, and a death that arrived far too early. And as we continue through the objects left beside him, we can begin to reconstruct not only how a pharaoh was buried, but what it may have meant to live as the boy king of Egypt more than 3,000 years ago. To imagine what it meant to live as Tutankhamun, we have to look beyond the tomb and return to the world outside it, to the Nile Valley at the height of Egypt's new kingdom. The river was the great source of life, flowing through a landscape surrounded by desert. Each year its waters shaped agriculture, transportation, trade, and the rhythm of ordinary existence. Villages stood among fields of wheat and barley, fishermen worked along the river, craftsmen produced pottery and tools, and boats carried people and goods between cities. Above this enormous society stood the royal court, separated from everyday life by ceremony, wealth, and sacred authority. Tutankhamun would have lived within palace complexes filled with painted walls, decorated floors, gardens, pools, storerooms, workshops, kitchens, and administrative offices. Royal residences were not silent stone monuments like the ruins we see today. They were colourful, busy environments. Walls could be painted with plants, animals, foreign landscapes, and scenes celebrating the king. Floors might show ponds filled with fish and birds. Furniture was decorated with precious materials. Incense and perfumes filled ceremonial spaces. Musicians, servants, scribes, guards, priests, craftsmen, and officials moved through the palace performing tasks that supported the royal household. Tutankhamun's clothing would often have been made from fine linen. Jewellery carried both decorative and religious meaning. Broad collars, bracelets, rings, pendants, and amulets could identify status while offering symbolic protection. During ceremonies, the king might wear elaborate crowns associated with different aspects of royal power. The famous blue crown appears repeatedly in New Kingdom art, while other crowns represented Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, or the Unified Kingdom. The pharaoh's appearance was carefully constructed because he was not presented merely as a political leader. He was the sacred centre of Egyptian order. Meals within the palace could include bread, vegetables, fruit, fish, meat, beer, and wine. Archaeological evidence from Tutankhamun's tomb shows that food and drink were important enough to accompany him into eternity. Wine jars carried labels recording details of their production. Some contained vintages from royal estates. Meat had been prepared for preservation and burial. These offerings reflected the belief that the comforts and necessities of earthly life should continue after death. Outside the palace, Egypt's wealth depended upon an enormous network of workers. Farmers produced crops along the Nile. Scribes recorded taxes and supplies. Craftsmen worked in specialized communities. Quarrymen cut stone from distant landscapes. Miners searched for gold and other valuable resources. Soldiers protected borders and participated in campaigns. Traders and diplomats connected Egypt with neighboring powers. The young king stood at the top of this system, but his life depended on countless people whose names have disappeared. Some of the most skilled workers lived near the Valley of the Kings at a settlement now known as Deir el-Medina. These craftsmen carved and decorated royal tombs for generations. They were unusually literate for their time, and surviving documents reveal details about their wages, disputes, families, illnesses, and daily concerns. Although we cannot identify every worker involved with Tutankhamun's burial, people from this highly specialized world would have understood the techniques required to prepare royal resting places. They knew how to carve limestone, apply plaster, draw figures, mix pigments, and write sacred texts. When the king died unexpectedly, such skills became urgently important. The 70-day period associated with mummification provided a limited window for burial preparations. While embalmers worked on Tutankhamun's body, others prepared the tomb and gathered its contents. Imagine the activity during those weeks. Officials selected objects from royal storerooms. Craftsmen altered inscriptions. Painters completed walls. Priests organized ceremonies. Furniture, chariots, clothing, jewelry, food, and ritual equipment were assembled. Some items may have belonged to Tutankhamun during life. Others were created specifically for the funeral. Still others may have been adapted from objects originally intended for another member of the royal family. The goal was not archaeological perfection. The goal was to ensure that the king entered eternity properly equipped. When the body was ready, one of the most important moments of the funeral was the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ritual symbolically restored the deceased person's ability to breathe, speak, see, hear, and receive offerings in the afterlife. In Tutankhamun's burial chamber, a painted scene shows Ay performing this ritual before the dead king. The image is historically significant because Ay wears royal symbols, indicating that he had already assumed the throne. Tutankhamun's funeral therefore records the transfer of power from one ruler to the next. While the dead king was being prepared for eternal life, the living kingdom already had a new pharaoh. After the funeral, Ay ruled Egypt for only a few years. His own tomb was prepared in the western branch of the Valley of the Kings. Then Horemheb took power. Unlike Tutankhamun and Ay, Horemheb was not a member of the immediate Amarna royal family. He came from a military background and presented his reign as a restoration of stability. Under him, the memory of Akhenaten's religious revolution was attacked more systematically. Monuments were dismantled and royal history was reorganized. Horemheb even counted his regnal years in a way that effectively absorbed the reigns of the rulers who had come immediately before him. Tutankhamun was pushed toward historical invisibility. This political erasure explains a strange contrast. His tomb contained spectacular wealth, yet later Egyptians knew remarkably little about him. The king, whose golden face would eventually become recognizable across the planet, was almost absent from the official memory of his own civilization. Centuries passed, and Egypt itself changed. The new kingdom weakened. Different dynasties rose to power. Foreign rulers arrived. Nubian kings governed Egypt. Assyrians invaded. Persian emperors claimed the country. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great entered Egypt and was welcomed as a ruler. After his death, the Ptolemaic dynasty governed from Alexandria, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions. Cleopatra VII became the most famous ruler of that final dynasty. Then, in 30 BC, Egypt became part of the Roman world. Through all of these transformations, Tutankhamun remained underground. People still visited the Valley of the Kings during antiquity, and some ancient travelers even left graffiti inside accessible tombs. But KV-62 remained hidden. Christianity eventually transformed Egypt's religious landscape. Temples that had once echoed with prayers to Amun, Ra, Osiris, and other gods lost their original functions. Centuries later, Arabic became the dominant language following the Islamic conquest. The ability to read hieroglyphs disappeared. Even if someone had encountered Tutankhamun's name carved into stone, its meaning would have been inaccessible. Ancient Egypt became a civilization surrounded by mystery. Hieroglyphs covered monuments, but nobody could fully understand them. This began to change dramatically after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. The stone carried related texts in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and ancient Greek scripts. Because scholars could read Greek, it offered a key to understanding the lost Egyptian writing system. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion announced a major breakthrough in deciphering hieroglyphs. Suddenly, the monuments could speak again. Names of kings could be identified. Religious texts could be studied. Thousands of inscriptions that had remained silent for centuries became sources of history. By the time Howard Carter began working in Egypt, archaeology had entered a new era. Researchers could read royal names and compare inscriptions across monuments. Small clues suggested that a pharaoh called Tutankhamun had existed near the end of the 18th dynasty. Objects bearing his name had appeared in the Valley of the Kings, yet his tomb remained missing. To Carter, this absence was important. If Tutankhamun had been buried in the valley, and if no known tomb could confidently be identified as his, perhaps the burial was still waiting to be found. It was a possibility many others considered unlikely. The valley had been excavated extensively, but Carter continued to believe that somewhere beneath the accumulated debris an overlooked patch of ground concealed the answer. His persistence eventually brought him to that first step in November 1922. The discovery seems almost inevitable when told afterward, but it was anything but inevitable. Carter could have stopped one season earlier. Carnarvon could have refused further funding. Ancient thieves could have returned to the tomb. Workers constructing the tomb of Rameses VI could have discovered KV-62 thousands of years before Carter. Any one of these events might have changed the story completely. Instead, the staircase remained hidden until archaeology had developed photography, conservation methods, and systematic documentation capable of recording much of what was found. This combination of ancient accident and modern timing made Tutankhamun unique. His burial was not completely untouched, but enough survived in its original context to offer an extraordinary window into Royal Egypt. And even after decades of study, the collection continues to reveal details. Every inscription, material, repair, stain, tool mark, and fragment can become evidence. The tomb that once seemed to offer a single spectacular discovery has instead become a century-long investigation. Behind the golden mask lies not one mystery but hundreds, stretching from the identity of craftsmen who made the treasures to the final illness of the young king himself. One of the most fascinating questions surrounding Tutankhamun is how much of the treasure found inside KV62 actually belonged to him during his lifetime. At first glance, everything in the tomb appears to form a single, carefully prepared royal collection, but closer examination reveals a more complicated story. Some objects carry signs that names or inscriptions were altered. Others appear stylistically connected to the reign of Akhenaten or to members of the royal family who lived before Tutankhamun. This has led scholars to consider whether the unexpected death of the young king forced officials to gather burial equipment from different sources. A pharaoh's funeral could not simply be delayed for years while craftsmen produced every object from the beginning. The body had to undergo mummification, rituals had to be performed, and the burial had to proceed within the traditions of Egyptian royal death. If Tutankhamun died suddenly, the court may have faced an enormous logistical challenge. Objects already available in royal workshops or storerooms could be modified, reinscribed, and placed in his tomb. This possibility offers a glimpse of the urgency that may have followed his death. Somewhere in the palace, officials were deciding who would rule Egypt next. Somewhere else, embalmers were preparing the young king's body, craftsmen were completing objects, priests were organizing ceremonies, and workers were finishing the burial chamber. At the same time, Ankhesenamun was confronting a future without her husband and without a surviving child to inherit the throne. The political uncertainty surrounding these weeks remains one of the most intriguing parts of the story. The Hittite documents describing an Egyptian queen asking for a foreign prince become especially dramatic in this context. If the queen was Ankhesenamun, she may have believed that marrying one of her own subjects would place her in a dangerous or unacceptable position. She wrote to a foreign king, according to the Hittite account, declaring that her husband had died and that she had no son. The Hittite ruler was astonished. Egypt was one of the great powers of the ancient world, and royal daughters were generally not sent abroad to marry foreign rulers. For an Egyptian queen to request a foreign husband was highly unusual. Suppiluliuma therefore suspected deception and sent an envoy to investigate. The queen reportedly wrote again, insisting that she had not written to any other country and asking why he doubted her. Eventually the Hittite king agreed to send his sons an answer, but the prince died before reaching the Egyptian court. The Hittites believed foul play was involved, and the incident contributed to hostility between the two powers. We cannot confidently place Tutankhamun at the center of this episode, because the Egyptian queen is not named clearly enough for complete certainty. Yet, if Ankhesenamun was responsible, then the quiet chambers of KV62 hide the aftermath of an extraordinary political crisis. Her husband had died at 18 or 19. Their children were dead. The dynasty was collapsing and powerful older men surrounded the throne. Soon, Ay became pharaoh. His connection to Ankhesenamun after Tutankhamun's death is uncertain, and then the young queen disappears from surviving records. Her disappearance is striking because she had once occupied one of the most important positions in Egypt. No securely identified burial has provided a clear ending to her story. It is possible that future archaeology may one day reveal more. Perhaps an undiscovered tomb contains her remains. Perhaps an inscription waits beneath the sand that will explain what happened after Tutankhamun's funeral. Until then, her fate remains part of the silence surrounding the final years of the Amarna royal family. The same silence surrounds many people whose hands created the objects now associated with Tutankhamun. We admire the golden mask, but we do not know the name of the master craftsman who shaped its face. We examine the throne, but the artists who created its intimate image of the king and queen are largely invisible to history. Goldsmiths, carpenters, painters, stoneworkers, leatherworkers, weavers, scribes, and embalmers all contributed to the burial. Their work survived more successfully than their identities. Imagine a workshop in ancient Egypt during the weeks after the king's death. Lamps illuminate craftsmen working late into the evening. Gold is hammered into thin sheets. Wooden surfaces are prepared for decoration. Hieroglyphs are carefully drawn and carved. Stones are fitted into jewellery. Linen is measured and folded. Containers are filled with oils and perfumes. Officials inspect the work because the deadline cannot move. The king must be buried. Every object has to satisfy both practical and sacred requirements. Mistakes can be corrected, names can be altered, and existing equipment can be adapted, but the ceremonies must eventually begin. Meanwhile, embalmers work in a different sacred environment. Tutankhamun's body is washed and prepared. The internal organs are treated separately. Natron removes moisture from the tissues. The skin is treated with oils and resins. Linen slowly transforms the body into the recognizable form of a royal mummy. Priests recite ritual words, and protective objects are placed within the wrappings. The process is physical, but it is also religious. The Egyptians are not merely preserving a corpse. They believe they are preparing their king to become an eternal being. The preservation of the face is particularly meaningful, because identity had to survive death. The dead needed to remain recognizable, both physically and spiritually. This makes the golden mask especially powerful. It provided Tutankhamun with an idealized eternal face, one that would never age beyond youth. The real king may have experienced illness, pain, and physical limitations, but the golden king was perfect. His eyes remained open, his features remained calm, his royal symbols declared authority forever. There is something haunting about the fact that the face designed never to be seen by living people became one of the most famous faces on Earth. The priests who placed it over Tutankhamun could not have imagined museums, photography, television, or millions of visitors. They expected darkness. They expected the burial chamber to remain closed. Their work was intended for the gods and the dead. When the final shrine was sealed, the mask vanished from human sight. Outside the tomb, the funeral procession eventually ended and life resumed. Farmers returned to their fields. Officials served a new king. Priests continued rituals in temples. The Nile rose and fell. Children were born who would grow old without remembering Tutankhamun. Within only a few generations, political changes pushed his name toward obscurity. The people who had personally known him died. The craftsmen who had prepared his burial disappeared. The language continued changing. Centuries accumulated. Eventually, even the meaning of the hieroglyphs on his possessions was lost to the living world. But the objects remained exactly where the funeral party had left them, except for disturbances caused by ancient thieves and natural changes inside the tomb. A throne waited without a king. Chariots waited without horses. Sandals waited without feet. Wine jars remained sealed long after their vineyards disappeared. The small coffins of Tutankhamun's daughters remained beside their father. And the golden mask continued covering the young king, while the world above transformed beyond anything ancient Egyptians could have imagined. When Carter's team finally entered, they did something the original builders had worked desperately to prevent. They reversed the burial process. Doorways were opened, shrines were dismantled, the sarcophagus was exposed, coffins were separated, the mummy was revealed, objects meant to accompany Tutankhamun forever were removed one by one. From a modern archaeological perspective, this allowed an extraordinary civilization to be studied. From the perspective of the ancient people who sealed the tomb, however, it would have represented the breaking of boundaries designed to last for eternity. Perhaps this contrast helped the curse stories become so powerful. Even without believing in supernatural punishment, there is something unsettling about entering a room that people deliberately sealed 3,000 years ago. The silence, the darkness, the sacred images, and the presence of the dead create an atmosphere unlike an ordinary archaeological site. Carter was not simply discovering objects. He was entering a space constructed around ancient beliefs about death, transformation, and eternity. And at the center of that space lay a young king whose entire burial had been designed around one hope: that although his earthly life had ended almost before it began, his existence would somehow continue forever. And even after more than a century of study, Tutankhamun continues to reveal new details about the civilization that placed him beneath the Valley of the Kings. The treasures removed from Cave 62 became subjects of careful conservation, allowing researchers to examine materials and techniques that ancient craftsmen had mastered thousands of years ago. Beneath the beauty of the gold were signs of human hands, tiny tool marks, repairs, changes to inscriptions, and decisions made during the hurried preparations for the young king's funeral. These details remind us that the objects surrounding Tutankhamun did not simply appear inside his tomb. Thousands of hours of work were required to create them. Craftsmen shaped wood, hammered gold, carved stone, prepared pigments, wove linen, and assembled jewellery with remarkable precision. Some of these workers may have spent their entire lives producing objects for temples and royal families, never imagining that their creations would survive longer than the cities in which they lived. The tomb also preserved evidence of Egypt's connections with the wider ancient world. Materials used in royal objects came from distant regions through trade, diplomacy, tribute, and military expansion. Cedar could arrive from the eastern Mediterranean. Gold came from territories to the south. Precious stones and unusual materials travelled across enormous distances before reaching royal workshops. Egypt under the 18th dynasty was not an isolated civilization. It was part of a network of powerful kingdoms whose rulers exchanged letters, gifts, marriages, and demands. Tutankhamun inherited this international world while still a child. Letters preserved from the broader Amarna period show kings communicating with one another about gold, alliances, royal marriages, and political disputes. Foreign rulers addressed the pharaoh as a fellow great king, and Egyptian wealth made the court enormously influential. Yet behind this international prestige, Tutankhamun's own kingdom was still recovering from the changes introduced by Akhenaten. Restoring the traditional gods was not simply a religious decision. Temples were major economic institutions that controlled land, employed workers, stored resources, and connected the monarchy with communities across Egypt. Rebuilding those relationships helped restore political stability. Tutankhamun's reign therefore represented a bridge between two worlds: the revolutionary experiment of his father's generation and the return to older traditions that would dominate after his death. Had Tutankhamun lived another 30 or 40 years, his place in history might have been completely different. He might have built enormous temples, led campaigns, produced surviving heirs, and established a dynasty of his own. His tomb might have been much larger and perhaps far more visible. Ironically, a longer and more successful reign could have made his burial easier for ancient robbers to locate. Instead, his short life produced a small tomb that disappeared beneath later activity and survived long enough to make him famous. History sometimes preserves people for reasons no one could predict. Tutankhamun became immortal not because he constructed the largest monument, but because the smallest details of his burial escaped destruction. Even today, researchers continue asking questions about objects that Carter's team first catalogued generations ago. New imaging methods can reveal writing hidden beneath surfaces. Chemical analysis can identify substances inside ancient containers. Microscopic examination can show how materials were cut or joined. Digital reconstruction allows scholars to study how the tomb looked before thousands of objects were removed. The investigation that began with a staircase in 1922 has never truly ended, and the Valley of the Kings itself still holds mysteries. The cliffs appear silent and empty from a distance, but beneath them lies a network of chambers created for rulers, relatives, and powerful individuals of the new kingdom. Some tombs were known in antiquity and repeatedly entered. Others disappeared and were rediscovered only in modern times. Archaeologists continue surveying the landscape because Tutankhamun taught them an unforgettable lesson. Even a heavily explored place can conceal something extraordinary. Perhaps another sealed chamber remains somewhere beneath the rock. Perhaps the burial of Ankhesenamun waits to be identified. Perhaps new evidence connected with Nefertiti will eventually clarify the final years of the Amarna family. Archaeology cannot promise such discoveries, but the possibility remains. For now, the most complete witness to Tutankhamun's world is still the collection buried with him. Each object preserves a fragment of a life that ended too soon. The walking sticks suggest a king who may sometimes have struggled to move comfortably. The weapons present the ideal of royal strength. The throne preserves an intimate image of his queen beside him. The tiny coffins of his daughters reveal a private tragedy hidden among royal treasures. The food and wine show that those who buried him expected his needs to continue beyond death, and the golden mask transformed his young face into an image intended to survive eternity. When we look at that mask today, we are separated from its creator by more than 3,000 years, yet the distance can suddenly feel surprisingly small. Someone once held the tools that shaped its surface. Someone polished the gold. Someone carefully placed it over the wrapped head of the dead king. Someone stood inside the burial chamber knowing that the doors would soon close. Perhaps they believed no living person would ever see their work again. Then the shrines were sealed, the corridor was blocked, and the valley returned to silence. Above ground, the world continued without Tutankhamun. Generations passed until his family became history, then legend, then almost nothing at all. Yet beneath the earth, his name remained written in gold. That is the strange power of Tutankhamun's story. It begins with a child surrounded by the wealth of an empire, passes through religious upheaval, royal responsibility, illness, death, and a hurried funeral, then disappears into darkness for thousands of years, before beginning again with an archaeologist brushing dust from a stone step. The first life of Tutankhamun lasted less than 2 decades. His second life, carried through archaeology and human memory, has already lasted more than a century. And as long as people continue to wonder about the civilization along the Nile, the forgotten boy king and the silent chambers that protected him will continue to invite us back into the mysteries of ancient Egypt. But the rediscovery of Tutankhamun did more than return one forgotten king to history. It opened a window into the people who surrounded him, from powerful officials and priests to anonymous craftsmen, whose work survived long after their names disappeared. Every object inside the tomb had passed through human hands. Someone carved the wooden statues standing guard near the burial chamber. Someone carefully painted the hieroglyphs that protected the king. Someone prepared the linen wrapped around his body, while others filled containers with food, wine, oils, and perfumes. When these people completed their work, they could not have imagined that thousands of years later, researchers would examine every detail they left behind. Even imperfections became valuable evidence. A repaired surface could show that an object had been used before the burial. An altered royal name might reveal that an item had originally been prepared for someone else. A small mark made by a craftsman could help modern researchers understand how ancient workshops operated. In this way, Tutankhamun's tomb became a record not only of royalty, but of the society capable of creating a royal burial. The treasures also reveal how deeply Egyptians connected nature with ideas of eternity. The sun disappeared every evening and returned every morning, becoming a powerful symbol of death and rebirth. The Nile rose and renewed the agricultural land, bringing life back to fields after the dry season. Scarab beetles became associated with renewal, while the lotus could symbolize regeneration. These patterns shaped Egyptian ideas about what happened after death. To them, Tutankhamun's burial was not the conclusion of his story. It was preparation for another beginning. This is why so much care was given to preserving his body. If the king was to continue existing, his physical form needed protection. Yet preservation was only one part of the process. His identity also had to survive. His name appeared repeatedly throughout the burial equipment because Egyptians believed the destruction of a person's name threatened their continued existence. Ironically, later rulers attempted to erase the memory of Tutankhamun and his family from official history, but inside the sealed tomb his name remained protected. On coffins, shrines, jewelry, statues, and other objects, The young king's identity waited silently for someone who could read it again. When hieroglyphs were deciphered in the 19th century, ancient royal names regained their voices. By the time Carter searched the valley, Tutankhamun was no longer completely unknown. Archaeologists had encountered objects carrying his name and knew that a king with that identity had existed. The mystery was where he had been buried. Carter believed the answer remained beneath the valley, and his confidence was based on years of studying its geography and previous discoveries. The search required patience that is easy to overlook when we remember only the dramatic moment of discovery. Excavation meant removing enormous quantities of debris under difficult conditions. Areas had to be cleared systematically. Findings had to be recorded. Seasons could pass without the result everyone hoped for. Lord Carnarvon had invested considerable money into the project, and eventually the lack of a major discovery threatened its continuation. Carter's request for one final season became one of the most consequential decisions in archaeological history. If the search had ended earlier, the entrance to KV 62 might have remained beneath the ground for years or perhaps decades longer. Instead, workers returned in 1922 and began clearing an area near the tomb of Rameses VI. Then came the first stone step. What followed has been told so many times that it almost feels like legend, but the basic sequence remains extraordinary. The staircase descended toward a sealed doorway. Behind it was a corridor filled with rubble. At the far end stood another doorway. Carter made a small opening and held a light toward the darkness. Gold reflected back. After thousands of years of silence, the tomb had been found. Yet imagine the moment from another perspective. The last ancient person to leave those chambers had walked away believing the king was prepared for eternity. That person's world contained no electricity, cameras, automobiles, airplanes, or modern nations. By the time humans returned, they arrived with photographic equipment, electric lighting, scientific instruments, and the ability to send news of the discovery around the planet. The tomb had remained still while humanity transformed outside it. This enormous separation in time is difficult to comprehend. 3,000 years is not simply a number. It represents more than 100 generations of human lives. Entire civilizations rose and disappeared during Tutankhamun's silence. Yet when the chamber was opened, a chair was still a chair, a sandal was still recognizable as footwear, and a board game still carried evidence of people seeking entertainment. These ordinary connections may be more powerful than the gold, because they remind us that ancient Egyptians were not mysterious figures existing only in monuments. They were people who ate meals, raised children, worked, celebrated, worried, became sick, loved, mourned, and hoped to be remembered. Tutankhamun happened to stand at the highest level of their society, but death reduced even a pharaoh to the same fundamental human problem faced by everyone. What remains when a life ends? The Egyptians answered that question with tombs, names, images, rituals, and memory. They tried to defeat disappearance by leaving something behind. In Tutankhamun's case, their attempt succeeded in a way they could never have anticipated. The kingdom that buried him is gone. The priests who spoke the sacred words are gone. The craftsmen who shaped his treasures are gone. Even the language they spoke evolved and disappeared from everyday life. But the young king remains known. His story crossed a silence of more than 3 millennia and entered a world completely different from his own. And somewhere beneath all the gold and mystery is a simple truth. Tutankhamun became famous because something fragile survived. A small tomb survived robbers. A name survived erasure. A body survived time. And a staircase remained hidden until someone decided to keep searching. Today, when we speak his name, we continue a chain of memory that began beside the Nile more than 3,000 years ago. The boy who once walked through the palaces of ancient Egypt could never have imagined our world. But through the objects left around him, we can still look back toward his. And the deeper we look into that distant world, the more we realize that the greatest treasure inside KV62 was not gold at all. It was the chance to hear, through the silence of history, the faint echo of a life that time almost erased. And as researchers continued studying the objects from KV62, they began to understand that the tomb preserved something even larger than the memory of one young pharaoh. It preserved a moment when ancient Egypt stood between change and tradition, between the revolutionary world created by Akhenaten and the restoration that followed under Tutankhamun. Every artifact became part of that transition. Some objects reflected older traditions that had existed for centuries, while others still carried traces of the unusual artistic style of the Amarna period. Together they showed that history rarely changes in a single moment. Even when rulers announce new beliefs or restore old customs, traces of the past remain in art, language, architecture, and everyday life. Tutankhamun himself stood at the center of this transformation. His original name connected him to Aten, while the name remembered today connected him to Amun. His childhood belonged to one religious world, while his reign helped restore another. Had he lived longer, perhaps historians would know him as the king who fully stabilized Egypt after Akhenaten. Instead, his early death left that work unfinished and placed his legacy in the hands of those who followed. Yet there is another side of his world that the golden treasures can easily overshadow. Beyond the palace walls, most Egyptians lived lives far removed from royal luxury. Farmers worked along the Nile, depending on the river and the agricultural cycle for survival. Craftsmen spent long days producing pottery, tools, furniture, textiles, and stonework. Fishermen moved across the water in small boats. Scribes recorded taxes, grain, property, and official orders. Soldiers guarded borders and travelled on campaigns. Children learned the skills of their families, while priests maintained temples dedicated to gods whose worship had survived generations. When Tutankhamun became king, these people continued their ordinary routines. Many may never have seen him. Some would have known his face only through statues or temple images, yet his name appeared throughout the institutions that governed their world. To them, the pharaoh represented more than a distant ruler. Egyptian ideology placed him at the center of maintaining order against chaos. The annual rhythms of the Nile, the prosperity of the land, victory over enemies, and harmony with the gods were symbolically connected to kingship. This made the death of a pharaoh a moment of enormous importance. The king had died, but Egypt could not remain without a ruler. As Tutankhamun was prepared for eternity, I assumed the responsibilities of kingship. The transition had to appear orderly even if uncertainty existed behind palace doors. This may explain why the burial chamber shows Ay performing the opening of the mouth ceremony. The image presents continuity. Tutankhamun enters the divine world while his successor continues royal authority among the living. The kingdom survives even as one king disappears. For Tutankhamun, however, the earthly journey was finished. Once the funeral procession reached the valley, the objects that had surrounded him in life took on new meanings. A bed became furniture for eternity. A chariot became transportation for the afterlife. Food became an eternal offering. Jewelry became protection. Statues became magical assistants. Even weapons could protect the king against dangers imagined beyond death. The burial transformed everyday objects into sacred equipment. Some of the most interesting pieces are those that show evidence of use. They suggest that not everything was manufactured solely for the funeral. Tutankhamun may have touched or used certain objects while alive. When Carter's team handled them thousands of years later, they were touching the same surfaces that had once existed within the Boy King's daily world. This physical connection across time is one of archaeology's quietest wonders. A written history can tell us that a king lived, but an object can show us the size of his sandals, the shape of his chair, or the games that entertained people around him. Through such details, Tutankhamun becomes less like a distant symbol and more like a person. Even his famous mask, despite its idealized beauty, invites us to wonder about the face beneath it. Modern reconstructions have attempted to approximate his appearance using information from the mummy and medical imaging, but no reconstruction can perfectly recover the living young man. Skin tone, expression, hairstyle, movement, and countless small details disappear with time. We can reconstruct bones more confidently than personality. We can identify royal titles more easily than emotions. Perhaps Tutankhamun was quiet and cautious. Perhaps he enjoyed hunting despite physical difficulties. Perhaps he loved the ceremonies of kingship, or perhaps they felt like obligations imposed upon a child. Perhaps he trusted Ay and Horemheb, or perhaps palace politics made trust difficult. History cannot answer these questions, and it is important not to turn imagination into fact. Still, asking them reminds us that behind every ancient monument stood human beings whose inner lives were as complicated as our own. The same is true of Ankhesenamun. In the tomb's arch, she appears beside Tutankhamun in moments of closeness. She was also young and had experienced the dramatic transformation of her father's reign, the abandonment of Amarna, the restoration of traditional religion, the loss of her children, and finally the death of her husband. Then she disappears from history. Her silence feels especially powerful because Tutankhamun's burial survived in such extraordinary detail while almost nothing securely reveals her final years. One person became globally famous, the other faded into uncertainty. Perhaps somewhere in Egypt an undiscovered inscription or burial still carries her story. Until such evidence appears, we are left with fragments, and fragments are what history often gives us. The past does not survive evenly. One king's tomb remains filled with thousands of objects, while another ruler's burial is destroyed. A letter survives while an entire palace disappears. A golden mask crosses 3,000 years almost intact, while the thoughts of the person who wore it vanish forever. Archaeology works within this imbalance, patiently gathering what remains and resisting the temptation to pretend that every mystery has an answer. Tutankhamun teaches this lesson particularly well. We know an extraordinary amount about his burial, yet some of the simplest questions about his life remain unanswered. We know how he was prepared for death more clearly than how he spent many of his days alive. We know what surrounded his mummy, but not what surrounded him during his final hours. And perhaps that is why his story continues to pull us back toward the Valley of the Kings. Every answer seems to lead toward another closed doorway, another faint inscription, another question waiting in the darkness. More than 3,000 years after Tutankhamun was carried into KV-62, the search for the boy behind the golden mask is still not truly finished, and perhaps this was the deepest reason Tutankhamun's story survived so powerfully. His life was brief, his political achievements were modest compared with those of Egypt's greatest conquerors and builders, and his name was nearly erased from history, yet his burial preserved something far more intimate than a list of victories. It preserved the world that surrounded a young king at the moment of his death. Through the objects placed beside him, we can still glimpse the people who loved him, served him, dressed him, protected him, and prepared him for a journey they believed would never end. More than 3,000 years later, those objects allow us to stand at the edge of that vanished world. We can look at the throne where Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun appear together and imagine the royal couple before tragedy separated them. We can see the walking sticks that may have supported the king when movement became difficult. We can examine the bows and chariots that represented the strength expected of a pharaoh. We can look at the tiny coffins of his daughters and understand that behind the wealth of the royal court existed the same experiences of hope and loss that have followed human families throughout history. We can look at the golden mask and remember that beneath its perfect expression rested not an immortal god, but a young man who never reached his 20th birthday. The ancient Egyptians understood this difference between human weakness and eternal ideals in their own way. Their kings grew old, became sick, suffered injuries, and died like everyone else. But Egyptian religion offered a vision in which death could be overcome through transformation. The tomb was built around that promise. Tutankhamun's body was preserved because physical identity mattered. His name was written because a name allowed a person to continue existing. His image was repeated because representation could preserve presence. Food was provided because life continued. Amulets protected him because dangers remained. Sacred words guided him because the journey required knowledge. Gold surrounded him because eternity demanded materials associated with the divine. Every layer of his burial repeated the same message. Death did not have to be the end. In an unexpected way, history fulfilled part of that ancient hope. Not in the form the priests intended, but through memory. Tutankhamun's physical life ended around 1323 BC, yet his name now survives across languages and continents. His face appears in museums, books, classrooms, films, and documentaries. People who live thousands of kilometers from the Nile recognize his golden mask immediately. Millions who know almost nothing about the 18th dynasty still know the name Tutankhamun. The boy king achieved a kind of immortality, although not the one his burial rituals were designed to create. His second life began slowly. For centuries he remained forgotten beneath the valley. Then archaeology rediscovered traces of his existence. Howard Carter became convinced that the missing tomb could still be found. Years of searching followed. Seasons ended without the discovery he wanted. Funding became uncertain. Then, during what might have been the final attempt, a worker uncovered a step beneath the rubble. That single step changed the history of archaeology. Beneath it lay another, and then another, descending toward a sealed doorway. Behind that doorway waited a corridor. Beyond the corridor stood another sealed entrance, and beyond that entrance was a room filled with objects that seemed to shine out of another age. The famous moment when Carter looked through the opening remains powerful because it captures the instant when forgotten history became visible again. For more than 3,000 years, no one had stood there and seen the chamber in that way. Then candlelight crossed the darkness, reflected from gilded surfaces, and revealed what Carter called wonderful things. But the true wonder was not simply that the objects were valuable, it was that they were still there. Ancient thieves had failed to empty the tomb, later builders had accidentally concealed it. Centuries of change had passed above it. Modern excavators had searched nearby without finding it. Against extraordinary odds, enough of the burial survived for the story to be reconstructed. The discovery reminds us how much of human history may still be hidden. Archaeologists have explored Egypt for generations, yet new tombs, settlements, inscriptions, and artifacts continue to emerge. Beneath desert sands and modern cities may lie evidence capable of changing what we think we know about the past. Sometimes that evidence is spectacular gold. More often it is something small, a fragment of pottery, a line of writing, a human bone, a tool, a seed, or a footprint. Archaeology turns these fragments into questions, and slowly those questions become stories. Tutankhamun's tomb happened to preserve thousands of fragments together, making his story unusually rich. Even so, mysteries remain. We still cannot describe his final illness with complete certainty. We do not know exactly what happened during his last days. We cannot say how much authority he personally exercised as a teenager. We do not know the full story of Ankhesenamun after his death. We cannot identify every person who created the objects in his tomb. We cannot know what the young king thought when he stood inside a temple, rode through the countryside, or watched the sun set over the Nile. The evidence reaches across thousands of years, but there are limits to how far it can take us. Perhaps that uncertainty is part of the reason the story remains so compelling. Tutankhamun is close enough for us to see his possessions, examine his body, and reconstruct his family, yet distant enough that much of his life remains beyond our reach. He exists between history and mystery. Every scientific investigation makes him more understandable, while reminding us of everything that time has taken away. Today, the Valley of the Kings is no longer the silent royal cemetery it once was. Visitors travel from around the world to walk through its dry landscape and enter tombs carved into the cliffs. The sunlight outside can be intense, But inside the chambers, the atmosphere changes. Stone passages descend beneath the earth. Painted figures and hieroglyphs cover walls created by artists who lived thousands of years ago. The ancient Egyptians who built these places believed they were constructing gateways between the world of the living and the world beyond death. Among those tombs is KV 62, the small burial that became more famous than many of its enormous neighbours. Tutankhamun's mummy remains connected to the place where he was buried, while the treasures recovered from his tomb are preserved as part of Egypt's cultural heritage. The objects are no longer hidden from human eyes. They are studied, conserved and displayed so that generations separated from Tutankhamun by more than 3 millennia can encounter the craftsmanship of his civilization. The golden mask that once rested in complete darkness now stands beneath carefully controlled museum lighting. The transformation is extraordinary. An object created for eternity inside a sealed tomb became an ambassador for an entire civilization. Yet when we look at the mask, it is worth remembering the person beneath it. Tutankhamun was not born as a legend. He was a child born into a royal family during a period of upheaval. He inherited the throne at an age when most children are only beginning to understand the world around them. He lived among powerful advisors, ancient religious traditions, political uncertainty, and expectations that would have overwhelmed almost anyone. He married young. He appears to have experienced health problems. His children did not survive. Then, while still at the beginning of adulthood, his own life ended. The grand story came afterward. His body was carried into the valley. Priests performed the ancient ceremonies. His possessions were placed around him. The doors were closed, and the entrance was hidden. Those who attended the funeral eventually died themselves. Their children and grandchildren disappeared into history. Tutankhamun's kingdom changed, his dynasty ended, and his language eventually fell silent. Still he remained beneath the earth. Imagine the final night after the burial. The last workers have left the valley. The desert air grows cooler. Above the cliffs the stars appear one by one, the same stars Egyptian priests had watched for generations. Somewhere beyond the mountains the Nile continues flowing through fields and villages. In the darkness below, the young king lies surrounded by gold, food, clothing, weapons, games, sacred statues and prayers for eternity. No footsteps approach the sealed doorway. No voices enter the chamber. The candles are gone. The tomb becomes completely still. Years become decades. Decades become centuries. Centuries become millennia. Kingdoms rise and disappear, but the silence inside KV 62 remains. Then one day in November 1922, after more than 3,000 years, footsteps return. Rubble is removed. A staircase emerges. A doorway appears. A small opening is made, and light enters the darkness once again. In that moment, Tutankhamun returns to human memory. And that is where we leave him tonight, not simply as the owner of a golden mask or the subject of an ancient curse, but as a young person whose short life became one of history's longest-lasting stories. Somewhere between the flowing Nile, the silent desert, and the golden chambers beneath the Valley of the Kings, the boy king continues his journey through time. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through ancient Egypt with Midnight Historian. As the halls of Tutankhamun's tomb fade back into darkness and the desert settles beneath the stars, allow the sounds of the modern world to drift away as well. Close your eyes, rest comfortably, and imagine the Nile flowing peacefully beneath the moon, just as it did more than 3,000 years ago. The pharaohs are gone, their palaces have fallen silent, and the footsteps of their ancient world have disappeared, but their stories remain. Tonight, we remembered one of them. Good night, sleep peacefully, and until our next journey into history,